Hello and welcome to Share My World. I'm Charlie Dobre, and in each episode I'll be talking to guests about the places they visited in their life that they associate with happy memories. That could be a treasured childhood memory, a best ever holiday, or somewhere special they've shared with a loved one. The story of everyone's life is like a personal map of the world, and I want to explore that map and share it with you. So, to accompany this show, there's a website, sharemyworld.co.uk, where you can see the exact location of each of my guests' chosen places and even see how to get there yourself, if you feel so inclined. Today's guest is journalist and author Paul Hayward. Paul Hayward, welcome to Share My World. I'm not sure if you've ever actually been on Desert Island Discs, for example, but some people have. Is that a no? Is that a shake of the head?
They'd have to be scraping the barrel, Charlie.
It sounds like a sore point. I shouldn't even have gone there. I'm sorry about that. But this has been, well, the good news is this has been described to me as a Desert Island Discs, but using locations instead of music. So that's the idea. And we get to meet people and talk to people and curate that story via places people have been, because it's a bit of a no-brainer when you think about it, but pretty much every memory we can think of throughout our lifetime is associated with a place as well. And I'm really happy to say I'm excited about your journey, because there were lots of air miles to rack up from place to place on this one. It's a real globe-trotting journey as well. Just before we go on to that journey, I'm just going to ask you a little bit about currently what you're doing, because you stepped down from sports newspaper journalism 3 years ago.
Yes, it was 3 years ago.
And since then, I mean, you're already writing books, but you seem to have stepped even more into co-authoring books. Is that fair?
It is really. Yeah, I decided 3 years ago that I'd been on the road for long enough, and I wanted to try a few different things. And I've mainly been sort of embroiled in books. I wrote a 150-year biography of the England men's football team, which came out last year on the 150th anniversary of the first game. And then I turned my pen to a ghosted autobiography of Kevin Sinfield, the rugby league player who's raised £8 million for MND. So I've had 2 books in a row now, and I have to decide whether to carry on writing books or to go back to reporting or to do both. At the moment, I'm quite open-minded.
Oh, that's interesting, because I think those of us who enjoyed your prose in the Telegraph, Guardian, Mail, you name it, were a little bit sad when you stopped writing. So it's encouraging to hear you. So you may go back to journalism.
I hope so,
somewhat.
Because I've always considered myself a reporter. Really, the thing that I fell in love with when I was young was reporting. It was going out there and observing and listening and talking and making notes and trying to understand what was going on and then reporting it. And I used to read reporting, voraciously as a teenager. I remember thinking that's almost the highest form of literature in some ways, because that type of journalism is very important. And it may be less important now when everybody knows everything about what's going on all the time and they can see it digitally on social media and so on constantly, any time of the day or night. But when I began reporting at a higher currency, I think, and a greater importance in the presentation and conveying of news.
That's really interesting. So a challenge you wouldn't think about unless you were a journalist, but as soon as you say that, it makes me think that the challenge to modern day journalism is what is it for? What does it do? Because as you say, there's 24-hour news. You can be updated on a thing that happened, but presumably, I mean, that's good for people who are particularly good at journalism that write well, because it's the insight that you're adding the value to rather than just the news piece.
Yes.
That, would you say?
And I would say that a lot of modern journalism is really opinion masquerading as journalism. It's not frontline reporting. Media organizations have sort of disinvested in what I consider to be real journalism, which is reportage, and instead are aggregating news, digitalized news, or sort of making noise and giving opinion and sermonizing all the time. So I'd like to think that young journalists coming into the business now will still be given the opportunity to go out there and to actually listen to people and to record with a notebook and to observe and evaluate and then send back to whoever's willing to read it a piece of journalism, a piece of reporting.
And do you think, I mean, just before we get on to the locations, it also brings to mind a question for me, which is, if you were to get back into journalism, I wonder whether it would be back into the mainstream media, as it's called, or whether there's an incredible mission for someone with your experience and skill to join maybe one of the newer media owners and really kind of up their output. Does that idea ever kind of come to you? You might think, I won't go to the classic title, I'll go somewhere else if I did.
Certainly. As you know, Charlie, there's a tremendous casualty rate in new forms of media outlets. If you think of Vice and BuzzFeed and the sort of brave new world of online only news, looked very promising at first, but it's taken an almighty hit. The business model for online journalism and new forms of reporting hasn't been particularly promising or successful. And the older media forms, particularly the newspaper empires and so on, are becoming, digital platforms. They still do print, but they do it more and more reluctantly. And you'll see this retreat from print journalism accelerate, I think. But it's still not clear to me, anyway, what's going to replace it. You could write online for the New York Times or Tortoise or the London Review of Books, whoever it is. But ultimately, that all that journalism is behind paywalls for obvious reasons, because you have to recover the cost of producing it. But that means that inhibits or reduces the audience it actually reaches. So there's this constant battle between revenue and reach.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? It's, in the perfect world, people would want as much, I don't know, news coverage, different opinions from different parts of the world, from different sections, from diverse people. It's just someone's got to pay for it.
It is. It's a very unclear business model.
That affects all of it. Yeah. So the future is unclear. However, our first stopping point is going to be back in the 60s, I guess, Paul, in terms of your first location that you've given us. I'm going to guess it's the 60s, and the photograph that you've sent, which is two splendid young men in, it looks like American football outfits, but I'm not sure. But I could be wrong, but you've taken us to Vermont in the States, well, just south of the Canadian border, I guess. So tell us about why you chose that place and the when of it as well.
These are my first childhood memories, really. We lived in Sussex, but my mother was a nurse, NHS nurse, and my father was a police officer. And in the late 60s, they decided they wanted an adventure, which was emigrating to the States. And it was the summer of 1968, and we ended up at Boston Airport without a job, really, or a home to go to. I remember being in a motel at Boston Airport while my dad applied for jobs and tried to find accommodation for us in New England. And we ended up in Burlington, Vermont, which is Bernie Sanders' hometown, of course, on the banks of Lake Champlain. And my dad got a job in working for IBM in security, and my mum worked at the local hospital as a nurse. And it was an idealized America, certainly for a 4-year-old child. We watched Little League baseball, and we went to pizza parlors. In the summer, we went down to Lake Champlain and swam off the beaches there. And it was a part of America, or it is a part of America, with 4 distinct seasons. And that's one of the most vivid memories I have of it. You had the obviously glorious golden autumn that everybody knows about. You had hot summers where you could swim in the lakes. And you had these winters where the snow was so deep that I could barely leave the house, because the minute I stepped off the back step, I was submerged in snow, because I was, probably about 2 foot high. And it was a kind of magical outdoor world. And for a child to see America in that light was very beguiling. And yet, in the background, as I learned later, there were lots of political undercurrents. It was during the Vietnam War, of course, and young men down our street in Burlington were disappearing to Canada to escape the draft. And I have a hazy memory of a father coming to our house and crying in our kitchen because his son had fled to Canada. And this guy was so ashamed of his son for, dodging the Vietnam draft, that he just couldn't cope. And it was the only tiny intimation I had as a child that there was other stuff going on in America. I couldn't see the civil rights struggle. I couldn't see the Vietnam War. I was in this sort of magical haze of swimming and baseball and pizzas. But it's very interesting to look back now and think that, the idealized America I thought I saw in the late 60s wasn't quite that perfect.
But that's so interesting. But as a 4-year-old, because sometimes it makes me think that sometimes I worry that, in the modern age, I remember when I had kids at primary school, which was a while ago, and it was a primary school in Lewis, where I live, which was very focused on climate change. And I used to worry that giving kids that young that much knowledge was just going to scare the
Mm.
crap out of them. And actually, thinking about you as a 4-year-old, and this sounds like absolutely idyllic setting. I mean, you were probably quite right to be unaware of it because you were a child. I mean, you don't have some sense of regret. Are you just sort of noting that you didn't know, or do you feel part of you think, "Gosh, I almost feel guilty. I was having this great time." And
No, I don't think I feel guilty about it. What was interesting about it was that I suppose through cinema and literature and so on, we're accustomed to America idealizing itself and presenting itself as this, the ultimate destination, the place of dreams. And it was just intriguing later in life to realize that I was in a sort of manufactured world, really, not the Truman Show exactly, because it was a bit more real than that. But I mean, I have this immense fondness for it. I've been back 2 or 3 times, and I fly to Boston and I drive across through New England to Burlington, and I always feel this sort of intense happiness driving into or traveling into Burlington and settling down by the lake. And I always go to the old newspaper building, the Burlington Free Press, and Vermont is a very sort of un-American state in a way. I'm not sure whether you've ever been there, Charlie, but I would really recommend it to you. It's quite European in its feel. It's quite liberal, obviously, and it's a place of stunning beauty because it has mountains and lakes, and as I said, it has these seasons, and it has a sort of like a cinematic American quality to it.
yeah, I mean, it's something which I have only, like many, as I'm sure, seen on cinema or television shows, and it looks, and the way you describe it sounds wonderful. How long did you live there for? In your childhood?
We lived there for 3.5 years, and we came back. I think it was to do with my grandparents saying they missed us, and later on, my mum explained to me that it was only ever intended to be a kind of short adventure. But there's a part of me that,
I see.
as much as I've loved my life in Britain, and I certainly wouldn't.
Don't talk Britain down, Paul. Come
This
on,
is the bit where I say, "Why the hell did we leave Vermont?"
Well, listen. I won't be the only person listening to this thinking, why did they leave Vermont?
I mean, I guess anything could have happened. I could have ended up in all sorts of trouble, and I don't regret my life in Britain, but certainly when I go back there now, I wander around Burlington thinking this must have been a great place to grow up. But I had 3.5 years of it, and it's still there. So it's always, I can always go back to it.
No, that's true. And listen, and you're in wonderful Sussex, East Sussex, to be clear. Nothing wrong with West Sussex, but East Sussex, which I don't know. Sorry about that. Are there some similarities? I'm thinking in terms of the leafiness. I haven't been to Vermont. I don't know. Do you find yourself drawn to East Sussex in a way that has some familiarity from childhood? I'm probably overplaying it there.
It's funny you should mention the East-West Sussex divide, because my granddad was mayor of Lewis in the 50s. He was a builder in the town, and he never recognised the division of East and West Sussex, or he said it should never happen anyway. He thought it was an abomination. So I picked that up from him. So I just call it Sussex. I never say East Sussex or West Sussex.
Perhaps you're quite right. You're quite, and I should apologise to all listeners in the county town of Lewis to suggest that this ridiculous division.
Well, we could summon an army to reunify the county, couldn't we? Possibly.
It's possible. If anyone can do it, Lewis can do it, I think, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But we digress. Let's move on. That's a really interesting insight. Who's the other football team? Whose strip are you wearing?
That's the New York Giants, because my dad went down to New York on a business trip once and came back with these New York Giants uniform. So that's my brother Neil in the photograph with me. And we were kitted up in those pristine 60s American football outfits with no logos. You won't see a logo on that kit at all.
No logo and
Yeah.
helmets as well. I mean, a bit dodgy for a 4-year-old. Oh, no, it's superb. And if people are listening to this thinking, why the heck are you describing photographs? I should say that there's a video version on YouTube at youtube.com/sharemyworld. And also, if you go to sharemyworld.co.uk, you can see all the photographs, and also you can see maps and all the locations, and even how to get there yourself if you wanted to. So you can be in on the fantastic photograph as well. It is a classic. Now let's move on. The second place we asked you to talk about is a favourite holiday destination, and clearly you're well travelled. So this time you seem to have, I don't know if I'm correct to call it a city. So you've gone for Japan, not quite inside Tokyo, is that right? Just outside Tokyo. But tell us about your favourite holiday
this is
location.
cheating slightly because most of my holidays were actually work trips. But I mean, readers might call it one long holiday. I actually did some work along the way over those 30 years. But I could never separate the experience of working somewhere for a month or 5 weeks and the feeling that I was a tourist in the sense that I was trying to immerse myself and understand the place I was in. You know, I never wanted to go to a foreign country and feel like I was passing through. I was always just there to cover games and report. I always wanted to try and understand the place I was in. And so I spent a month in Japan at the 2002 World Cup and again at the 2019 Rugby World Cup. And both times I was just transfixed really by the people, the culture, the bullet trains, the Shinkansen. You know, anybody who travels on the UK rail network who then goes to travel on the Shinkansen in Tokyo is
talking the UK down again, Paul.
I've got to stop. I really have to stop. But to shoot up and down Japan on those Shinkansen trains where they wheel a trolley down the aisle and give you bento boxes or sell you bento boxes and beer, you know, while the coast is flying past at 200 miles an hour is that's pretty liberating for a UK rail passenger. But that apart, the food, the art, the aesthetics, and the sort of strangely Zen-like feel in what is a teeming country. If you haven't been there, you look at Japan and you think, well, it's everybody's just rushing and crushing, and you know, it's a sort of manic corporate environment. But you go and you find it to be anything but. It is that in the working sense. But then you find these temples and parks, and you feel these kind of zones of contemplation and reflection, and you start to realize that Japanese people really kind of value their personal space and their peace, and they relate to each other in a very interesting way. So it's a kind of fascinating country, and of course, there's nothing quite beats the experience of arriving in a Japanese Tokyo tube or train station, and the bewilderment you feel, the utter sense of you're just going to die there. You can't possibly find your way out or find the train you're meant to be getting on. It's a tide of bewilderment, and that's quite fun because once you get through it and your brain starts to pick up signals and work out what you need to do next, it becomes a really good fun challenge.
But at that time, I mean, let me ask again. I've not been to Tokyo, but there is signage presumably in English. It's an international city. Is it just the sheer scale and madness of humanity in one place, which is kind of bewildering?
Yeah, it is, and I think one of the I think it's Shinjuku metro station, which is a sort of hub in the center of Tokyo. I think there are something like 112 entrances and exits from that tube station. You know, and there's a convergence of dozens and dozens of train lines, and you have to work out which one you need to be on to get to a game or a press conference or wherever you're going. And it's a sort of you know, that's an overwhelming shock, but it's a shock that feels good somehow because it completely shakes you out of all your assumptions and knowledge, and then you start to realize you're in a culture, in a society that is absolutely nothing like yours in so many ways, but is profoundly is profoundly interesting and contemplate and challenging. But of course, it's a very urban environment, and there are academics who say that Japan is slowly killing its natural environment, because in popular images we think of Mount Fuji and we think of lovely gardens and cherry blossom trees. That Japan is harder to find, but when you do find it, you feel that you're somewhere special. I mean, I would just recommend it to anyone. Go there for a month and lose yourself.
Yeah, and it sounds like one of those places you need to go there for a period of time rather than just a little holiday. The location you sent, it looks like Shibuya City, which is like a suburb of Tokyo. Was there a particular place in Tokyo then that you outside Tokyo you liked? And also the photograph people will be able to see on the website depicts a beautiful like alley evening scene with like lanterns lighting it up. Was there a particular moment or place there that really got you? Are you laughing?
No.
You don't want to talk about it.
I'm laughing actually because that picture I sent you that alley is actually known as Piss Alley because seriously, it's because the American servicemen used to go down there and urinate quite a lot apparently. But in the picture, and when you're in it, eating and drinking and talking to people, you're in this sort of this sort of magical capsule of what you think of as a Japanese imagery, and it's wonderful. You sit there looking at the graphics and the colours, and this wonderful food comes over the counter, and there are people buzzing around. So it's a wonderful place to be, but it has a rather unpromising moniker.
Just to be clear, that's not the official title up in Google
I
Maps.
don't think the tourists will call it that. No. And finally, I suppose on Japan, I'm a bit of a Japanese denim addict. So I had a wonderful trip one day out on Japanese denim. It just fascinates me. It's so brilliant and so well made that there's a company called Ironheart. They've got a motorcycle warehouse depot about an hour out of the center of Tokyo, and everybody's sitting there on Harley Davidsons, all these really very cool Japanese bikers, and it's an emporium of jeans and denim jackets and everything. And so I took a trip out there one day and was just completely in my element.
Wow. And it's seriously spooky. I'm sitting here, I'm wearing Japanese denim.
I always knew
trousers.
You were a man of discernment.
I was thinking what's really high quality denim is going to look really nice, and
no, it's not cheap.
Not cheap.
No, it's not.
I'm not going to lie. But hopefully, as long as my waistline stays similar, they'll last a long time. But that's another story. So let's move on. So the third location we ask people to look at is a place which is significant in terms of your career, or in that sense, career or job. And I guess we shouldn't be too surprised on this one, but I'm interested in how it fits in, because you started, like, your journalism life started in racing, didn't it? At the Racing Post. So you were very much like a horse racing correspondent for a period of time before.
I was at first, yeah. And the reason was it's to do with Lewes Racecourse, which closed in September 1964. And I'm always amazed by how many people who live in Lewes don't actually know there was a racecourse up there and never actually visit it. It's one of the most blissful places in the world. It's the site of the Battle of Lewes in 1264, of course, as well. So you could call it the cradle of parliamentary democracy, which is probably not something to shout about at the moment, the way Parliament is behaving. But when I was a boy, we ran a pub in North Wales for a while, and I used to come back to Lewes. I was born in Cuckfield, but we used to come back to Lewes as children and stay with my grandparents on the Neville estate. And one of the things I used to do was sort of go through the gate at the bottom of the garden and go up onto the racecourse and watch the horses work early in the morning. And at that time, there were hundreds of horses in Lewes and lots of trainers. And at dawn, or just after dawn, you'd hear the drum of hooves. The larks would be singing. There'd be a heat haze on the turf, on the gallops. The sun would be coming up, and it was the most magical thing. And I just completely fell in love with racing through that experience of watching horses work. I was probably 12 years old, and next door to us, there was a young lad next door who knew Paul Eddery very well. Paul Eddery was the brother of the champion jockey, Pat Eddery, and we'd be playing on the football on the rec, and he would say, "Oh, my brother's champion jockey," and I'd say, "So?" and thought nothing of it until I started researching Pat Eddery and realised that he was a big deal. And I started following him as you would a football team, actually. And so by the age of 12 or 13, I knew that I already knew I wanted to write for a living, and I already knew that I loved sport and horse racing. So I thought I'll just combine them. I'll just put them together. And so from that time on, I never really had a doubt about what I wanted to do for a living.
That's interesting, isn't it? So when you were there, it was still being used because, as you say, it shut in 1964, wasn't it? I think the last race was September 1964. But after that point, there were still some stables. There were still people keeping horses there.
Yeah, there were stables in the golden era of racing in Lewes. There were stables all over town, sort of squeezed into every kind of nook and cranny in the town itself. And there were quite big yards up near where the prison is for people who know Lewes. And there were hundreds of racehorses stabled at Lewes. There was a Derby winner came out of Lewes, a Grand National winner came out of Lewes, and it was a thriving, racing town. Now, I wouldn't have thought there'd be more than 20 horses up there in one yard. So it's very much an industry in retreat from the Lewes perspective.
I was just going to ask Paul that the time when the British Horse Racing Board basically withdrew the funding, didn't they, and shut it down. It was, am I right in thinking that it was kind of a choice between Lewes and Brighton, but people thought Lewes was just a bit too windy? It was a bit kind of, because it's right for people who won't know it, it's on top of a hill, and it can be windy up there. But still, presumably still a great place to watch racing, and maybe it was just a bit hard done by, do you think, at that point?
Yeah, I think, as I understand it, that one problem was that there was only one road in and one road out. I read somewhere that there wasn't any running water, which seems a bit bizarre. I can't quite believe that, but it was a bit isolated, and it was a bit, it couldn't match Brighton in its facilities and its sort of, general appeal. But I interviewed Lester Piggott once, and I was desperate, and I knew he'd ridden at Lewes, and I'd got pictures of him riding at Lewes. So I said to him, I said, do you remember riding at Lewes Racecourse? He said, yeah. He said, I rode there in the early 60s, late 50s. And he looked at me and said, it wasn't very good, really. Shook his head, and I thought, thanks, you've just broken my heart, Lester. That's fine, let's move on. And I think that was the general view.
Honestly, it was just a bit of, did you say it's just a bit of wind? I mean, Leicester is just a bit of wind.
Yes,
get over
it must have been that. But the great Fred Archer, who was a legend of the 19th century, I mean, a household name in horse racing, the first great superstar jockey, rode his last race at Lewes and then went back to Newmarket and shot himself, which adds a cheery note to that story. But
no connection
there. No, I think he'd been gambling and he was struggling with eating disorders. But so it's quite an historic place in many ways, but now it's just an extremely good place to walk your dog.
Yeah, I'm sure dog walkers would be very. And I think the old stands have been turned into some of them turned into houses, haven't they? I think the basis of some of the stands.
Very nice houses.
Your next place, we asked you to look somewhere which had special memories with members of the family or close friends or something like that. And we're going to change continents again. We're back on the plane, and this time we are in New Orleans, and I don't know. I don't know if you are a massive New Orleans jazz fan or whatever the reason, but it's a superb venue anyway. So please tell us about your special place.
My carbon footprint on this show is adding up alarmingly, isn't it? And I can only apologise for it. But yeah, this was a family holiday we had after I'd covered the 2014 World Cup in Brazil. And I like jazz. And I know purists will say that, New Orleans is mostly tourist jazz. I think that's a very, superficial judgment. And because all over town, all over the city, you can find every type of jazz from, trad to avant-garde. And it's obviously got this tremendous shambolic energy to it. And it's a very vulnerable place. It's a place quite unlike anywhere else in America. And I loved it. We all loved it, and we had this wonderful time, just swinging through the French Quarter, and I think it was just a perfect sort of come down after covering a World Cup in Brazil, which itself was great fun, I should say, and it actually gives me a chance to say that it's also New Orleans is also is at the centre of my favourite political book, which I'm going to hold up now, The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, which actually starts in with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Now, this brilliant book, which explains so much of the modern world, is about disaster capitalism, and it's about the way it starts with the American kind of Chicago school economic faction kind of steaming into New Orleans after the hurricane and after the city flooded, and privatizing all the state schools in the city. So she uses Hurricane Katrina and what happened to New Orleans in the aftermath as a sort of a classic example of how disaster capitalism works. And then she fans out from there to explain, obviously, how unfettered market economics have come to sort of conquer much of the world. And to me, it explains everything, and it explains actually quite a lot about what's happened in our country over the last 20 years, the assault on public services, this idea that the market should always be the determinant of everything. And you realize that this isn't accidental. This started as an ideology with Chicago school economics and Thatcherism and Reaganism in the 70s and 80s. And what we're seeing now is a continuation of that campaign. And Naomi Klein describes it just stupendously well. And all the lights go on in your mind when you read that book, because you're able to add everything together and get this global picture of what's actually happened to Western societies, particularly in the last 30 years. And it just happens to start with Hurricane Katrina. So I apologize if that's a contrivance, Charlie, but I was desperate to get that in.
No, I'm very, very happy for you to get that in. I mean, and the particular venue that you chose there's nothing wrong with the contrivance, it's fine. The particular venue you've chosen in New Orleans, it seems to me to be just one of the archetypes, one of the homes of true New Orleans jazz. And probably, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned about disaster capitalism, but also in terms of traditional jazz in New Orleans at a time when maybe rock and roll was the thing and jazz was in decline. You know, maybe this was almost a kind of a necessary place to protect the heritage of jazz, much as, you know, capitalism may have been marauding after Hurricane Katrina, but rock and roll was marauding around the 60s as well. Tell us the actual venue that you've given the photograph of.
That's so true. That's the Preservation Hall in downtown New Orleans, and it's in a very popular place with tourists. It's a small kind of wooden room, very yellowed, very atmospheric. And 3 times a night, this aging band of musicians, and it's a rotating band of musicians, come out and play this glorious New Orleans jazz. I think I got so hooked on it, I went 2 or 3 times. I just couldn't stay away from the place. And what was, apart from the atmosphere and the brilliance of the playing, you file in and you sit down on the floor, and the first thing the band leader says is no pictures, no phones, you know. And off they go, and you can hear in the music, you can hear the roots of so much of modern music, and certainly the whole lineage of jazz, but also blues and rock and roll. So you can sit on this wooden floor in this fabulously small and but sort of atmospheric room and just hear so much. And so I've got such fond memories of sitting on the floor in the Preservation Hall on those nights.
And isn't it so interesting that you couldn't take pictures or, you know, start recording it? You had to literally, guess what, be there and let it go in, and that would be your memory. The music, the feeling would be your memory.
Yeah, they sold CDs, and I bought a sort of box set CD of the Preservation Hall Jazz, which I treasure. But it was a very uncommercial operation. You know, there was the clientele was 50% tourist, probably more. But it didn't look like it was. It turned itself into a brand. You know, it was the real thing, and it was just people. I realized how many people there are in New Orleans who just want to play jazz and just play jazz all their life there, and they're not going to surrender. You know, and they don't expect to make lots of money, and they're trying to hold body and soul together, and all sorts of unfortunate things happen to them, but they're there to play jazz.
And interesting as well that it seems to be the musicians they use are all like 60, 70, 80, 90. It's not the assumption that a music scene is going to be let's hear what young people are doing. Nothing wrong with that and all good, but very interesting that this is focused on really quite old people, Paul.
Yeah, well, yes, veterans of the jazz scene, and I was looking at some of the musicians and thinking, God, I admire you for still doing this, because it would have been easier just to walk away. Obviously, they were getting paid and it was a living for them, but there was no sense at all that it's just a job to them. You can't walk into a place like that and start patronising people. But I did feel that they had a sense of the heritage of the music, and they were determined to keep it going, really. And then elsewhere, obviously in New Orleans, as you know, there were lots of other types of jazz club, and you could just again, talk about losing yourself. You could spend days and days just wandering in and out of these places, listening to music and feeling transported by it.
And by the sound of it, the thing you experienced there, which I think is going to be true of all locations that people think of in this show, is connection. You were allowed to be connected with the venue, but also with the people playing. You weren't excluded in any way.
That's right. It felt very democratic, really, and it felt quite permissive. Obviously, it's a kind of hedonistic environment, isn't it, downtown New Orleans? And as they used to say in Las Vegas, if we've got everything you want, and if we don't have it, we'll ship it in, sort of thing. It's and there were lots of there was this decaying, shambolic kind of water damaged, time damaged feel about everything, but there is also this kind of authenticity, and there's this sense of that people actually want to be there, and they develop a sense of belonging there. And that's why, of course, Katrina was so brutal, because it just swept everything away, or it swept everybody away for a time. Or certainly the poor people in the town, the rich people, as ever, were probably less affected by it.
That's interesting. Actually, it's another word you use there, which I think is a thread through all these locations, is authenticity as well. It's a very authentic experience in being there. Yeah, it's not manufactured in any way, is it, the places you've chosen?
Yes, I was there with my family. They flew out, and I flew from. Yeah, and all the children loved it, and they could see what it was about, and they were sort of agog watching the jazz in the Preservation Hall. I don't think any of them were particularly jazz fans when they went in there, but I think they probably were to some degree when they came out.
Let's move on from New Orleans. Back on the virtual plane. God, it's a good thing we're not actually flying to these places. So your next place is a location where you feel and have felt particularly at peace. And it's a stunning location. And the photograph you've sent is a stunning location, a stunning view with a gorgeous dog, which I think also helps probably as well. So tell us about the place that you chose.
I chose it because when we came back from Vermont, we ended up in North Wales, because that's where my mum's family was. And we ended up running a pub opposite Conway Castle. And for that, I was probably 7 years old when we got there. And what that gave you was an incredible outdoor life. So you had the fishing boats, you had the estuary. We used to go out fishing for mackerel in the summer, help with the crewing on the boats, and come back and sell mackerel on the harbour at Conway. And I don't think I appreciated at the time what a beautiful environment it was. It was just, we were just out all day. We'd leave the house at 8 a.m. and come back for some food at 8 o'clock and go to bed. It was a kind of gloriously outdoor life. And so I've always liked high places. I've always gravitated to high places in my life, which is why I love the Sussex Downs so much. And Conway Mountain is a peak. It's a beautiful spot because the panorama from there is extraordinary. You see across to the left, you see Anglesey and Puffin Island, and then you're looking out across the Irish Sea, and you scan round to the right, and you see the Great Orme, where a lot of my mum's family are buried. There's an amazing church up there called St Tudnose that dates from the 12th century, and again, that's a spectacular place to walk around on top of. But Conway Mountain gives you this perfect 360 perspective, and Snowdonia is behind you as well. So you've got sea, mountains, estuary, beach, and you've got this vast sweep of the sea heading out to Ireland. So there's a sense of distance and an incredible panorama, as I said. And I think when I stand on there, and I was in the picture, I stood on there with my dog, my lovely Labrador Ziggy, and I thought, this is, if you're looking for peace, you've come to the right place.
Wow. And when you're there, I mean, I'm looking at the view that you sent the photograph of, and again, people go to sharemyworld.co.uk, they can see it for themselves. But tell me, I mean, if you remember, when you're there, you're standing there, what do you feel? You've got this incredible vista around you. Can you say what it is that makes you feel at peace?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I wonder how much of what we think of as peace is formed in childhood. So very often when we talk about peace, we're actually talking about nostalgia or connection. So I think maybe when I stand on that mountain, I'm thinking about a childhood that was all about playing football and catching fish and messing about on the beach and being on boats. So maybe it's that. Maybe what you're really doing quite often is recalling sort of foundation formative experiences in your life. Or you could just be in somewhere that's incredibly breathtaking and stands alone as a place of beauty without any of those connections. I think that place for me qualifies on both counts.
No, I mean it looks absolutely stunning. Now I haven't been to this place. I've been nearby. I went to Prestatyn once but I'm not proud of it, because I might have been a similar age to you when you were 12, actually. There you go. So we went to Prestatyn as a family. We weren't quite as highbrow as you, or outdoorsy. And it was to a Pontins holiday camp. And my abiding memory is narrowly losing the donkey derby because I fell off the neck of the donkey just as I was about to hit the finishing line. And I think I've been a bit traumatized.
Yeah, that's going to stay with you. I mean, I hope you've had some help with that. Have you?
I've had a certain amount of help, but it was there because remember my dad was there as well. I just had a certain feeling of though he was fine. I just thought he was a bit disappointed. I'm not going to lie. I've been back another time, a few times after that, to Llangollen, to the International Eisteddfod, when I was in a school choir at that time, and that was a much more altogether peaceful experience.
I know the Eisteddfod world a bit. I mean, when I was growing up in North Wales in those 6 or 7 years, we Welsh nationalism was just sort of returning as a force. And I can remember we used to study Welsh all afternoon and everything else. Sorry, all morning, and then everything else in the afternoon. And
wow!
So I suppose I should be fluent, but I can't remember a word of it.
What would you like to conduct the rest of the interview?
I can say the name of the longest train station in the world, but you wouldn't want me to do that, would you?
That's one that starts Llanfair.
Yeah, that's not bad. Ends in Probably did about a third of it there, but it's actually Llanfair pwll Gwyngyll Golgerich Gwyn Drobor Llantysilio Gogogoch, and that's the only Welsh I've retained, I'm afraid. But it's a wonderful country.
That's really good. And just so you know, I'm going to edit on some applause for this particular part of the podcast as well, because as they say, that's easy.
And as a sports writer, I'm quite traumatised by the image of you falling off that donkey. I suppose it's possible it was fixed and you threw yourself off, but probably not, knowing you, Charlie.
No donkeys were harmed in the making of that race, so but I do think the donkey was retired after that because it too was in disgrace. But I can't really talk about that anymore. I'm not going to lie. Now listen, let's go somewhere really sunny and gorgeous, away from Wales. It's not a very well planned journey because we're going right back across the Atlantic and further as well. So this is where we ask you to name your favourite restaurant. And again, looks absolutely superb. I must admit, I haven't been there, but please tell us about this stunning place and all the time you spent on the Copacabana, which I'm sure.
Yes, it was. I spent longer there than England did in 2014, that's for sure, because they were, unfortunately, they were knocked out after, I think it was 6 days, actually. And so, obviously, the English press corps rather, decamped to a variety of hotels just off the Copacabana, and it was a dream of mine because I remember thinking if I could just hang on in this business to cover a World Cup in Brazil, I could die happy then, and I did cover a World Cup in Brazil, and just behind the Copacabana was this restaurant called Shirley. Now it was a neighborhood restaurant. It was a fish restaurant, and when people talk about restaurants, I would never think to pick out some Michelin star restaurant. I'm not really attracted to those types of places. Really, I can't quite see the point of them. But obviously on special occasions. But I think when you're traveling, the great thing is to find a a local restaurant where you can get to know the people who own it and work in it, and you start to feel comfortable there. You start to feel like it's your local restaurant, and you go back again and again and again. So we went to Shirley in Rio, and my mother was quite ill at the time, and so to go there was almost a tribute to her, and it was a way of thinking about her and remembering her. And I didn't tell everybody else that. I just told them it was a really good restaurant and we needed to keep going back. But every time I walked under that awning that said Shirley Restaurant, I felt I felt a connection with her. Inside was a world of noise and fun and very good food and lots of white wine. And again, Brazil takes some understanding and getting to know. Where we were was very touristy, but up the hill, just above that restaurant, was a favela where we went to watch a couple of Brazil games in bars, and that was so enjoyable. It was kind of it was important to get off the tourist trail and to not be protected by the military, because when Brazil stages a global event, World Cup or the Olympics, the army floods the streets of Rio to stop crime and to protect tourists. So you get this completely false idea of what it's like to be in Brazil. And there were people who live on the Ipanema and the Copacabana saying to me, well, enjoy the security, enjoy the safety, because when you've gone, the army will go too, and we'll be back in the old routine. So you end up having a false picture, a false experience of what it's like to be in these countries, because they manufacture the environment for the benefit of the visiting world. And I suppose that's true of the 2014 World Cup. It did feel that way, but at the same time, you could escape. You could escape that security cordon if you were minded to. And so eating in Shirley and talking about the day's football and having the games on in the corner and watching them while we had dinner was just one of those sort of memories I'll never forget.
Was that you and other correspondents and or local people? What was the kind of
well,
mix
it was other football reporters, other correspondents, but then but gradually you get to know the other sort of regular clientele in there, and you listen and you learn and you try and pick things up, and you just feel very privileged to be in there and to be part of it. And as you know, Charlie, there aren't many better things in life than being in a good restaurant abroad with a glass of wine and a meal and watching a game that you're not at. Obviously, you're not covering it, but a game on a TV in the corner, especially when it's Brazil. To watch Brazil in a bar or restaurant is different level.
I think that's definitely on the bucket list, that one, isn't it? Oh, I have to ask, because you mentioned heights as well. Did you go up to Christ the Redeemer, which is obviously just behind where you were, the restaurant, isn't it?
I didn't. I'm incredibly ashamed to say that I didn't get round to that. It was one of those things that I kept postponing and saying, "Oh well, I won't go today because there's a Roy Hodgson press conference. I'll go tomorrow," and I never got there.
Listen, if it was between Roy Hodgson and Christ the Redeemer,
he's very good. He's a great man, isn't he? But his World Cup experience that year was short and sweet. Or not sweet.
It wasn't the best, was it? As well, when you go around, you followed football events, and in particular, I guess, going around the world, you clearly try and, as far as you can, get into the culture and talk to people. Have you managed to give yourself a smattering of lots of different languages? How do you achieve that in such a relatively short period of time?
That's a good question about the languages. I think that's a tall order. I mean, you buy a phrase book before you leave, and you sit on the plane trying to pick up 20 or 30 phrases, and then you get there and it just completely goes out of the window, because it's quite stressful trying to talk Portuguese to Brazilian people, and you sort of, I'm afraid it's the old British conceit, isn't it? You just wait for the point where they give up and they start speaking English to you, and you think, oh, thank God, that's my ordeal is over. It's very lazy, and it's very presumptuous, but it works. We're incredibly privileged to be able to communicate in so many different countries, because we're English speakers. But beyond language, I think it's really about sort of going out there and just observing as much as you can. Keeping all your senses open, because it would be very easy just to pass through and go to your hotel, go to the game, file your reports, get on another plane and go somewhere else and do the same thing. And I feel that global sporting events in some ways. They land on host countries like spaceships, and they descend, they consume, and then they rise and they disappear. And very often they can suck the life out of a place. I think the Olympics does that sometimes. The Olympics actually that happened in Brazil after that World Cup. There was a tremendous amount of corruption around that, and elites kind of enriching themselves on construction budgets. Saw the same thing in Russia at the World Cup in 2018. I'm actually very suspicious in many ways of these big sporting events, because I think they're there to allow elites to sort of smash and grab, and there's no thought once the spectacle is over and the circus tent is taken down. There's not much concern for what happens in the country after that. The show moves on. The local people very often get ripped off. We've all had our entertainment, but I think it feels slightly scandalous to me that very often host countries are used in that way and volunteer to be used, because very often it's about the elites, grabbing what they can.
Yeah, it's just about national prestige, isn't it, for whoever the president or prime minister is sometimes at that time. And does that make you feel? I mean, the words you have written at all these tournaments are just superb and conjure up on and off the pitch. Does it also sometimes make you feel I'm kind of part of that, but I don't know how not to be part of these circles?
Yeah, it does, and I think any responsible media outlet will create a platform for somebody to keep saying that. It's no good writing about corruption a week before a big event and then just forgetting all about it when it starts. Sort of let's get the corruption out of the way early, and then we can get on with the fun and games. You have to stay true to that. You have to have perspective on what you've just seen, and you can't. It shouldn't just be pure escapism. If people have suffered as a consequence of you having a good time watching it all on TV, and you've got to keep. You can't write about the Olympics for 3 weeks and write every piece about corruption, because people will get sick of it. But you have to find a way of staying true to that theme, the through line of how it got there and who's benefiting from it, and the drug taking and all the rest of it. And then at the end, I think when you're with your sum up piece, your review of these big events, you have to revive those issues and say, let's not forget that behind the spectacle there was quite a lot of bad stuff going on.
So I mean, this is we're coming towards your last location, but you've really put a big question into my head, and it's been unfair at this stage of our chat. But I wonder whether, can you think of examples of, listen, the big tournaments are the World Cup, aren't they, and the Olympics? Can you think of examples where the promise was even partly delivered about the fact that we'll give it to this country which is either has high crime or is despotic, because it will really help change things? When it's gone, can you think of examples where that has happened?
Do you mean where there's been a beneficial effect of staging that?
Correct. So let's take the most recent World Cup. People had some very clear pros and cons about going to Qatar. You mentioned about the state of the government and crime in Brazil. We know about World Cups in Russia. Pretty much any country you can think of, there's always seems to have been the counterclaim saying we should take it there because it will have it will shine light. The people will be somehow better off afterwards. You're the best person to ask. In your experience, where these events have taken place, the spaceship has landed. When the spaceship has taken off, have things been in any way better?
I think mostly that idea of spreading the word and sharing the benefits and uplifting the country or the city is rhetoric. It's rhetoric that conceals a business ethic, it conceals a money-making urge. So when the World Cup went to South Africa, the men's football World Cup went to South Africa in 2010, there was a tremendous amount of rhetoric about that it was a transformative event for South Africa. Has it been? I wouldn't say so. In Brazil, as I said, there was a lot of social engineering that went on in Brazil around the World Cup and the Olympics. There was a creation of a new, almost new town on the edge of Brazil where the middle classes moved to, and then they kind of used the downtown. A lot's been written about this. They used the old central heart of Rio almost as a kind of as as billets for the workers that would get on this new train line that would go straight out to the Florida. They built a kind of Florida really on the outskirts of Rio that was the sort of the main Olympic area. And it was social engineering. It was an excuse. They used the Olympics to regenerate in a way that transferred wealth and power even more to the wealthy. And it's a very interesting thing. It's something that people should keep an eye on, really, the way that sporting events are used for those purposes. And in Sochi, the Sochi Winter Olympic Games, Putin's the Kremlin used that as a way of dividing a $50 billion construction budget around the elite, the oligarchs. And of course, on the sporting front, they used it as a means of winning medals through a state doping program. So you see these huge forces at play in global sport now, and we're in the midst now in football of obviously nation states, Gulf states buying football clubs. Saudi sports washing is accelerating very, very fast, and so we're sort of caught between our idealism about sport and our love of sport, and what is actually happening in the business and politics of sport, which in many cases is deeply alarming. I mean, just to finish on that point, you think about London 2012, the social engineering that went on during London 2012 was, and Ken Livingstone was right behind this as Mayor of London, was to transfer some influence and wealth and opportunity from West London to East London to rebalance London as a capital city. And I think you could argue that in some cases that's happened. I wouldn't want to be definitive on that. I'd leave it to others to judge. But the whole area around Stratford was regenerated, a lot of jobs created, houses built, and the Olympic Park is still there and still functioning, although a lot of the housing was sold off to sort of Qatari investment firms and so on. But in theory, London 2012 is an example of the Olympics being used for some constructive social purposes and not just for people to make money.
Yeah, I think that's probably, we don't want to appear, we shouldn't be overly talking up the country at this point. Paul having spent so long talking it down, but maybe that was an example of a positive infrastructure legacy. And certainly West Ham United are very grateful.
Yeah, I knew where you were going with this. I could see it. I shouldn't have given you the chance.
What a bargain that was. Now listen, let's end our journey, thankfully, just a bus ride away to the next country along. So this is where we ask guests to talk about a place that they haven't been to yet, they've never been to yet, but would really love to go to. And although you did name an entire country, which I may have to pin you down on, you did suggest that the photograph we use was, of course, a football photograph. And I think that, well, let me ask you about the country first of all, and then we'll go into maybe some of the football aspects of it and the reasons why you would want to spend some time there, because you've obviously been very close to it geographically, but haven't made it there before. So where is this place you've never been?
Well, it is the whole country, and it's Buenos Aires in particular. It's quite hard to emote about a country you've never been to, but if you love football and you've never been to the country that produced Diego Maradona and Lionel Messi, I'd say there's a hole in your experience. And from what people tell me and everything I read, if you've never been to the Buenos Aires derby, there's a hole in your experience as well. So, as a football writer, reporter, it's remiss of me never to have been to Argentina. I would say I've just never really had the opportunity, but I'm desperate to go, not just for footballing reasons, but because everybody speaks of it in such glowing terms. I mean, when you asked me this question, I've got a globe on my desk, and I was spinning it endlessly, trying to think of somewhere interesting, trying to think of a clever answer to your question. And I came up with Argentina because it's just been top of my list for so long. And I think that have you ever heard anybody say a bad word about a trip to Argentina? I'm not sure I have.
Well, I haven't. And one of my follow-up questions is going to be which part of Argentina, because you've got Patagonia in the south, just extraordinary, mountainous, incredible world. But then you've got rainforests in the north. I guess you wanted to see, you might have to spend 6 months there. Is there a particular part of it that appeals to you? Or
I think all those things, all those places really, Charlie. I was talking to someone, a Chilean or a man of Chilean heritage the other day in Lewis, funny enough, and he was telling me that Chile is about 4 countries in one, and you can have you can have 4 completely different climactic and geographical experiences from desert to sort of icebergs just by going up that coast. And I thought, well, the trick is then to go to Buenos Aires and then see Argentina and then travel up the coast of Chile and experience those 4 countries in one go. So I'm sure lots of people have done that on motorbikes and things, but anyway, it's sticking to one country, and I'm only allowed one place. I'll just go for Buenos Aires because it just sounds so fascinating, and I'd love to kind of look into the heart of that footballing obsession that we do see. There is something very distinctive about the football addiction in Argentina. The Brazilian one is romanticized. The Argentinian one I think is more calculating.
Visceral?
I don't mean that. Yeah, visceral and sort of a bit more calculating. I don't mean that in an insulting way, but Argentina is so serious about its football, and it's so deep. When they won the World Cup, those scenes in Buenos Aires were just biblical, weren't they? The celebratory.
Yeah, they were. It was really moving. It was very
Yeah.
moving, I think.
And what do you? I mean, you're a football person. What's that about? Where does that really come from? Ultimately, big question.
It's how long have you got, isn't it? I
Yeah.
think that, and we both know that to many people, football is more akin to a religion. It's a belief system than it is anything else, and I think that belief system is all about the fact that you can be at the bottom, you can get to the top. It's shared joy, it's connection if the club handles it well. And I think you're right. And when you think about Argentina, the reason I think so many neutrals were happy to see them win the World Cup was because we saw what it meant. Winning a football match means a lot to all of us. But as you say, there's something almost biblical, spiritual about the meaning of winning a football game to Argentina. And interesting, when you were giving me some notes about choosing Argentina and Buenos Aires, you mentioned about the the Buenos Aires derby, the Super Classico between Boca Juniors and River Plate, for those people that don't know. And I haven't been to one of those matches. I might be a little bit scared to go to one of those matches. I'd love to read one of your reports for those matches. But by all accounts, we are talking. I don't want to. It's not unfair. It's not fair to call it a war because there can be violence. Sometimes there isn't. But you're talking about an unbelievable mass experience of 2 teams in one city. And interestingly, because I know you've did a few nods in your responses today, which is great, to socialist principles. And you seem to have ended up with 2 teams, one of whom is now the working class team, and the other one is, well, probably unfairly, the millionaires team. So it seems to me that everything is pinned on that derby. And how extraordinary. I mean, presumably you would love to report on that phenomenon.
I would. If I could report on one football match now, it would be that. I think it's probably the biggest game that I haven't covered. And I'd be fascinated. And of course, it wouldn't be a football piece at all, would it? It would be the piece that you've just described. And of course, it's common in Spain and Italy and other places for you to say, oh, well, that's the derby match. One of them's the working class team and one of them's the middle class team. And it's really a social schism as much as a football match. And in the old days, people used to talk about Real Madrid and Barcelona being, Catalonia against royalist Spain. And it's a throwback to the Civil War. I think those echoes are quite remote now, personally. But yeah, it's just occurred to me, you don't really get these football matches anymore that are regarded as social clashes. They tend to be clashes of financial empires now, don't they? But the Buenos Aires derby, when I read about it, it does sound quite daunting. If you bought a ticket and stood in the wrong end or the wrong area, I think you probably need to be quite careful. But I guess that's where the exhilaration is. And the point you made about collective experience, I'm sure it's that in the end. What is a football rapture? Why does it seduce people en masse? It's because it gives us a chance to have a shared experience and to believe in something together. And there's something very religious about that. And look at England. England is an incredibly divided country. It's fractured in all sorts of ways. It's malfunctioning in all sorts of ways. But when the England women's team goes and wins the European Championship, or the Gareth Southgate's men's team get on a run in a tournament, then suddenly we're a mass, aren't we? We're sort of together in some strange way. We're rebonded, and I can't think of anything else really that could do that on that scale.
No, I think, however people make these estimates up of 4.5 billion football fans around the world, sounds about right. Given the world population, it has an extraordinary power, and you've had the incredible career so far and privilege to bear witness to some of the most extraordinary football occasions. This one is still to come. It's good to have something still to come, isn't it? You don't want to say this one, maybe the River Plate Boca Juniors match, but I think that would be a fantastic thing to do. I hope you get to do that sooner rather than later, actually, and I hope that selfishly, I hope you do have a return to journalism. I think it's missed by a lot of people, and I think this is one we'd all love to read the report on that. But it was it's been fantastic to spend some time with you, to go around the world.
Thank you,
rack
Charlie.
up the air miles virtually, thankfully, and just to hear about these incredible places. And I know it's always been a good interview because my very positive jealousy reading is very high at the end of certain talks, and it definitely is on this one. Although I can just walk across the Lewis Racecourse at any time I like. So
that's true. And you can climb Conway Mountain as well. Yeah,
I can climb Conway Mountain. Although I'm not good with heights, Paul. That's a terrible thing. So I'm working on it. That's a whole other story. Listen, thank you so much for spending time. We should just mention again the book you've co-authored, with Kevin, called The Extra Mile, which at the time of recording this podcast is very current. But even if it isn't, people should rush out and get it as well, because I think inspirational stories are clearly your thing that you're interested in, and you've definitely got one here. So best of luck with that book, and thank you so much for spending time on Share My World.
Thank you, Charlie. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
Share My World is a Good Intent Media production. For more episodes, visit sharemyworld.co.uk. Listen via your favourite podcast platform, or watch the video version at youtube.com/@sharemyworld. Thanks for listening and watching.